I was on air, halfway through a segment about a squirrel breaking into a vending machine, when my phone buzzed with a text that stopped me mid-sentence. It was my brother Max. 3 words: "I'm locked in." At first I thought it was a joke. He always had a dark sense of humor. But then a second message came through. A photo of his front yard, now completely enclosed in a black iron fence with a heavy-duty lock clamped at chest height. Max is paralyzed from the waist down. He's in a wheelchair, and the only thing standing between him and the outside world was a gate he physically couldn't open. The HOA had locked him inside his own house. No warning, no reason. Just a shiny new cage, courtesy of Karen. Max and I had always looked out for each other. When the accident happened, some idiot texting while driving, I flew across the country, bought the property next to his, and remodeled it so he could have his independence while knowing I was always 1 yard away. We thought we'd found a peaceful suburban neighborhood for him to heal. Instead, we got Karen. She introduced herself as the HOA president by handing Max a printed list of visual concerns. His wheelchair ramp? Not aesthetically uniform. His wind chimes? Audible disturbance. And now, apparently, his presence itself was some kind of visual blight on her cul-de-sac utopia. The gate must have gone up in the dead of night. Max had rolled to the end of the ramp that morning, planning to go to his therapy appointment, only to be greeted by an unyielding metal barrier. No note, no call, no explanation. Just steel bars and silence. I bolted out of the studio and was at his house in 20 minutes. I didn't even change out of my anchor suit. What I saw made my blood boil. The fence wasn't just illegal, it was personal. The lock was placed deliberately high, far out of reach for anyone in a wheelchair. This wasn't about property codes, this was about power. I confronted the first HOA officer I could find, a man in khakis with too much sunscreen and not enough spine. He told me Karen had authorized emergency perimeter control for non-compliant residences. I asked him if that phrase even meant anything or if he was just making it up on the spot. He stammered something about visual symmetry and pointed to a line in the HOA handbook, which was basically a novel full of arbitrary nonsense. Then he scurried off when I pulled out my phone and started recording. Max, to his credit, was trying to stay calm. But I could tell it was eating at him. He hated feeling helpless. He'd spent 2 years learning how to cook, fix things, navigate public transit. And now, because of one woman's obsessive need for control, he couldn't even leave his own front yard. He'd become a prisoner in the very house where he fought every day to prove he wasn't broken. I called Karen. She picked up on the 3rd ring, chipper as ever. "This is Karen, HOA president. How can I help improve your day?" I told her exactly what was happening. Her tone shifted immediately. "Your brother should have filed a request for access. The gate is for safety and community presentation. If he can't open it, maybe he should stay inside." My hand clenched around the phone. I told her she had 24 hours to take it down. She laughed. "Good luck with that," she said. "We don't take threats kindly here." What she didn't know was that I wasn't just Max's sister. I was a national TV anchor with a prime-time slot and a viewership in the millions. I'd covered government corruption, environmental disasters, celebrity scandals. And now? Now Karen and her little suburban dictatorship were going to be the story. I went back to the studio that night and rewrote my show from scratch. The title card, "Trapped in Suburbia: How an HOA Locked a Disabled Veteran Inside His Own Home." But before I went live, I spent the evening with Mac. We ate Thai food from the place down the street he couldn't get to anymore, and we laughed at how absurd it all was. "At least they didn't throw alligators in," he joked, tapping the gate with his spoon. Then he got quiet. "Do you think they're doing this to other people too?" That stopped me cold. Because of course it wasn't just about him. If Karen could do this once, she could do it again. Maybe she already had. The next morning, I flew a drone over Max's house to get a full aerial shot of the fence. From above, it looked even worse. like a prison yard in the middle of a quiet suburb. I edited the footage myself, added captions, cut in the video of Max trying to reach the lock, then turning around in frustration. I added my voiceover. This isn't a gated community. It's a gated cell. And the person inside? A paralyzed man whose only crime was surviving. Then I went live. That night, I told the country everything. I didn't hold back. I didn't sanitize. I named names. I showed receipts. And when the footage aired, my inbox exploded. Viewers were furious. Lawyers started reaching out. Activists too. It was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. And Karen? She had no idea her little fence had just triggered a national inferno. The night my segment aired, I sat with Max on his porch. Well, behind the gate on his porch, and we watched it together on his tablet. The moment the drone footage hit the screen, his face tensed. Not because he was embarrassed, but because seeing himself trapped in his own yard from an aerial view made it all feel more like a scene from a dystopian documentary than real life. I watched him swipe away a tear when the clip showed him reaching for the lock, failing, then quietly backing away. "You made me look like a trapped animal," he muttered, not angry, just tired. But he didn't look away. He wanted people to see. And they did. Within hours, our HOA's name was trending nationwide. My inbox became a war zone of tips, support, legal suggestions, and outrage. Several ADA attorneys reached out immediately, calling this not just immoral but clearly illegal. A few disability rights advocates even offered to fly out and help organize a protest. But what caught me off guard the most was how fast the public turned on Karen. A local mom group found her Facebook page and shared screenshots of her making passive-aggressive posts about maintaining the purity of our neighborhood. A veteran from across town posted a video titled, "My HOA tried the same thing. This reporter's brother could be any of us." And just like that, the floodgates opened. The next morning, the gate was still standing. Karen hadn't budged. In fact, she'd doubled down. A letter was taped to Max's fence. HOA stationery, typed out in her signature tight little font, stating that he was in violation of exterior design regulations due to excessive nonconformity, and that physical enclosures may be installed to shield the aesthetic impact of said nonconformity pending compliance review. Translation: she was calling Max's presence unsightly. I almost drove to her house right then and there, but Max stopped me. "Don't give her that satisfaction," he said. "We're winning, and she knows it." So instead, I turned to my greatest weapon, broadcast media. That evening, I hosted a follow-up segment titled "Power Trip in the Suburbs," when HOA presidents think they're above the law. I replayed the voicemail Karen left me after the first story aired, her voice syrupy and furious, threatening to file complaints against my brother for libelous character assassination and unauthorized public filming. I laughed on air. Then I brought on an actual legal expert to break it down. He confirmed, live on camera, that not only was Karen wrong, she'd likely just handed us evidence of intent to violate ADA protections. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't sitting idly. She called a neighborhood press conference, which was really just her standing in front of the HOA clubhouse with 3 board members behind her, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. She started by saying she was deeply saddened by the misrepresentation of this community, then shifted into a tirade about visual pollution and community standards. A local blogger streamed it live, and the internet lit up again, this time with memes of Karen standing next to the gate like a dictator at a border wall. But then Max surprised everyone. While Karen was trying to repair her image, he quietly installed a motion-sensing camera in the flower bed beside his ramp. One eye helped him set up through a phone app. That night, he captured a grainy but audible recording of 2 board members standing by the fence, laughing about how the cripple's probably crying in there, and saying Karen was finally fixing the disabled problem. Max sent it to me immediately. I played it the next night on my show without hesitation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Viewers were disgusted. One of the voices in the video was quickly identified as a local high school administrator. She was placed on leave within 12 hours. The other was an HOA treasurer who resigned before the weekend. The recording gave the story a whole new dimension. It wasn't just about a bad policy anymore, it was about targeted cruelty. The backlash intensified. Protesters began picketing near the HOA clubhouse. One of them carried a sign that read, "Accessibility is not an eyesore." Another, "Hey Karen, the 1950s called, they want their hate back." Max, to his credit, remained calm through all of it. He told me he was tired, not angry, just exhausted from years of having to prove that his life was worth the same as anyone else's. But I saw the fire behind his words. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told to stay out of sight because they didn't fit the aesthetic. And that fire fueled everything we did next. By Sunday, I was on my third live segment about the situation. The footage had been picked up by national networks. A popular late-night host did a segment joking that, if Karen were any more of a cartoon villain, she'd be tying Max to railroad tracks. And yet, despite everything, the gate still stood. Karen was stubborn, and she believed she could wait it out. She believed, deep down, that people would forget. But what she didn't understand is that when the story becomes bigger than the headline, when people feel it in their bones, they don't forget. They organize. They act. That's when we started digging deeper. Because if Karen had the gall to install a gate without notice or approval, there had to be more skeletons in her HOA closet. Max and I began collecting every piece of paper, every notice, every budget report he'd ever received. We even got a tip from a former board member who'd quietly stepped down 6 months earlier. She hinted that Karen had been funneling HOA funds to a private contractor, one suspiciously tied to her family. So we followed the money. And what we found? That was going to take this story from local injustice to a full-blown scandal. But first, we had to get Max out. Legally. Permanently. And we had one ace left to play. The first thread unraveled when Max handed me a crumpled document he'd nearly tossed in the recycling bin a few months ago. It was a standard HOA announcement about a beautification initiative, with a small line item on the last page referencing a security perimeter contract. The name of the vendor was barely legible, but enough of it remained for me to cross-reference it against the city's building permits database. What I discovered was that the contractor listed, Riverbend Modifications LLC, wasn't licensed to install any structures within residential zoning in our city. In fact, they weren't licensed at all. No permits had been filed for Max's gate, or any gate in the neighborhood for that matter. The company didn't even have a physical address. But after some more digging, a pattern emerged. Riverbend's business registration was tied to a P.O. box located 2 towns over, and the name on the registry was Leonard Kramer, Karen's cousin. That connection alone was enough to set my newsroom into overdrive. Our investigative team pulled tax records, contractor complaints, and even HOA expenditure reports. It all lined up. Karen had been funneling HOA money, dues paid by every resident, into a fake contractor shell to install whatever she wanted, wherever she wanted. Gates, fences, signs. All without legal approval. The worst part was, her improvements were mostly targeted at homes that didn't fit her personal standard. A family with an autistic child had a sensory play set removed. A war veteran had a flagpole shortened because it obstructed the skyline. And now Max had been caged in under the same twisted logic. But exposing it wasn't going to be enough. We needed proof on the ground. A former HOA board member named Rachel, who had quietly resigned the previous year, reached out to us privately. She met with me at a coffee shop and brought a flash drive loaded with emails, internal documents, and private messages between Karen and other board members. Reading through them felt like entering a parallel universe. Karen referred to Max as the speed bump in the driveway of community progress. She said things like, People who need ramps should stay in retirement villages, and once called disability ramps property value quicksand. It wasn't negligence. It was malice. With this information in hand, we contacted the city inspector's office. They agreed to send someone out immediately to evaluate the structure. The inspector arrived the next morning, a tall woman in a neon vest with zero patience for suburban theatrics. She took one look at the gate, flipped through our photos and paperwork, and muttered, "This thing's coming down." But there was a process. First, the HOA would be cited. Then the city would issue a removal order. Only if the HOA failed to comply could we remove the gate ourselves. That gave Karen time. Time to stall, delay, appeal, or worse, retaliate. Max was growing restless. His therapy appointments had been cancelled. He couldn't access his car. Even his groceries were being delivered to the porch while he waited behind iron bars like some neighborhood pariah. I could tell he was reaching the edge of his patience, even if he never said it out loud. And the hardest part was watching someone so resilient, so fiercely independent, be reduced to relying on handouts and hope while a petty tyrant played games with his dignity. Then came the firefighter visit. Max had a buddy named Jace who worked with the local fire department. He showed up one afternoon unannounced, in uniform, and pulled me aside with a grim look. "We had a call run through last night," he said. "Standard stuff, address drills, emergency access checks. Max's property came up." He hesitated. "Your brother's house is flagged as non-accessible. Meaning, if a fire breaks out, responders will be delayed unless we reroute or override access protocols. Someone listed his home as secured per HOA instruction. That flag puts him dead last in a crisis." My blood turned to ice. Karen hadn't just locked him in, she'd put his life on the line. That night, I filed an emergency motion through our ADA lawyer. Simultaneously, we hired a licensed city-approved contractor, on standby, to remove the gate the moment the order cleared. Within 48 hours it did. The city had reviewed the inspector's report, acknowledged the illegal installation, and authorized removal on the grounds of disability endangerment. It was finally time to free Max. We made it a production. Cameras, drone shots, reporters. If Karen wanted attention, she was about to get more than she could handle. The contractor showed up just after sunrise, tools in hand. The gate was welded at the hinges, so it took nearly 2 hours to dismantle the structure piece by piece. Karen arrived halfway through, screeching about property violations and unauthorized tampering. The city inspector was there too, calmly holding the removal order in her hand like a golden ticket. Karen tried to block the workers physically, until one of them held up his permit and said, "Ma'am, unless you'd like to be removed next, I suggest you step aside." The moment the final bolt clanged to the pavement, Max rolled down the ramp in a full spin, hands in the air. People from the neighborhood had gathered to watch. Someone clapped. Then a cheer went up. It wasn't a protest. It was a liberation. A celebration. Even the mailman gave Max a salute. I caught the whole thing on camera and closed my next broadcast with the footage. The title card read, "Free at Last, When Community Fights Back." But the story wasn't done. In fact, things were about to get a lot worse for Karen. Because with every bolt we pulled from that gate, we unearthed more lies. Her entire empire was built on fake permits, illegal contracts, and intimidation. And the next phase? It was time to take down the board itself. Because what started as one locked gate had just exposed a hidden network of corruption stretching far beyond a single neighborhood, and we weren't stopping until every piece of it collapsed. Karen's downfall didn't begin with handcuff. It began with a clipboard. 2 days after the gate came down, she called an emergency HOA meeting at the community clubhouse. The memo, which she personally delivered to every resident's door, promised clarity, correction, and a return to HOA integrity. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to spin the public humiliation she had suffered. But what she didn't anticipate was that her own board was already crumbling from the inside. Her iron grip was slipping, and some of the people she'd bullied into submission were finally ready to speak. Max and I arrived early, not because we were invited, but because at this point the neighborhood was firmly on our side. More than 24 people were already there, some carrying handmade signs, others just standing in quiet defiance. The clubhouse buzzed with tension. When Karen entered, her usual smug expression was missing. She wore sunglasses indoors and clutched that clipboard like it was a life raft. She stepped up to the podium and began reading from a prepared statement, filled with phrases like misunderstood intentions and community cohesion. But before she could even get through the first paragraph, one of the board members stood up, an older man named Bill who had been silent through most of her reign. He cleared his throat and said, "Karen, before you go any further, I'd like to yield my speaking time to someone else." Karen's eyes narrowed. "This isn't an open forum," she snapped. "I'm running this meeting." But Bill didn't sit down. He nodded to the back of the room. A woman rose, a former board secretary named Dana, and stepped forward, holding a binder. Her voice was calm, but the contents were incendiary. Dana began reading aloud from internal emails she had printed out. Messages from Karen that were laced with insults, threats, and blatant bias. One email discussed removing problem homeowners who don't align with our vision. Another mocked a resident's mental health treatment plan. And then came the bombshell, an email chain between Karen and her cousin Leonard, the fake contractor. In it, she detailed how to inflate quotes, obscure payment records, and keep the city's eyes off our projects. The room went silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Max wheeled himself forward, slow and steady, and said, "I'm not your problem. I'm your wake-up call." That was the moment the board collapsed. 2 more members resigned on the spot. The treasurer announced he had contacted the city clerk with concerns about financial irregularities. Then, as if scripted by fate, a plainclothes investigator from the ADA Compliance Division arrived with a city code enforcement officer in tow. They had been monitoring the broadcast. They had seen the footage. And now they had the emails. They politely asked Karen to step outside for questioning. She exploded. Not in tears, not in shame, but in fury. She launched into a tirade about how she was defending property values, how Max was using his disability as a weapon, and how the neighborhood had become unrecognizable under the pressure of public scrutiny. She knocked over a stack of HOA pamphlets and stormed out, hurling accusations at everyone from the city council to local dog walkers. The investigator followed her out with a quiet nod, but by then it didn't matter. Karen's reign was over. The days that followed were filled with fallout. Residents began reviewing years of HOA decisions, finding dozens of violations and misappropriations. City officials declared a formal audit. Max and I were interviewed by multiple national outlets. He spoke calmly about dignity, accessibility, and the long-term impact of being treated as less than by a system built to exclude people like him. His words resonated beyond the local scandal. They hit a nerve. Letters poured in from families across the country who had faced similar HOA abuses. Some had fought back. Others hadn't known how. The tipping point came when we received a call from a state legislator. She had been following the story and wanted to propose a new bill, one that would enforce stricter oversight on HOA decision-making, particularly when it impacted disabled or elderly residents. Max was invited to testify. I watched him sit before the committee, his voice steady, his tone respectful but firm. "No one should be locked inside their home for being inconvenient," he said. "No one should have to ask for permission to exist." When he finished, there was silence. Then applause. Karen, meanwhile, attempted to sue both Max and me for defamation. The case never made it past the first hearing. Her lawyer, clearly unprepared for the mountain of evidence and media scrutiny, quickly backed down. The judge not only dismissed the case but referred Karen's actions to the county district attorney for further review. Rumors circulated that she was being investigated for fraud, misuse of funds, and falsifying documents related to the fake contractor operation. She moved out of the neighborhood within the month, leaving behind a house with a "for sale" sign that was quickly defaced with sticky notes reading, "Not accessible" and "Not welcome." In the power vacuum she left, something unexpected happened. People started coming together. The HOA, now leaderless, voted to suspend operations temporarily while a professional third-party management group reviewed its bylaws. Max was nominated to a new advisory board, not as a figurehead or token representative, but as someone who had proven, beyond all doubt, that courage didn't need legs to stand tall. He accepted on one condition: that the first action be to revise the HOA charter to include mandatory accessibility audits and an open-door forum for marginalized voices. It passed unanimously, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again. People smiled at each other in the street. They checked on elderly neighbors. One resident even painted a mural on their garage, showing a wheelchair breaking through steel bars. The words underneath read, "We see you now." But even as peace returned, Max and I knew the story wasn't really over. Because somewhere, in another town, another Karen was probably measuring someone's ramp and calling it a violation. But now there was a blueprint for resistance. Now there was proof that one locked gate could open hundreds more. And every time I looked at my brother, stronger, freer, louder, I remembered the moment that started it all. A gate meant to trap him had set an entire movement free. Max's porch looked different now. Not because anything had physically changed. His ramp was the same, the flower beds still bloomed with the purple pansies he planted every spring, but because there was no longer a gate separating him from the world. No longer a symbol of isolation or control. That porch had gone from a cage to a platform. And now, as he sat beneath the shade of the overhang, microphones clipped to his collar and cameras trained on him, it had become a stage for change. We were filming the final segment of the story that had started as a desperate plea and evolved into a national movement. My producers had argued for a studio shoot, but I insisted, if this story was about home, about freedom, about visibility, then it needed to be told right here, in the place where Max had once been locked inside. The film crew respected the energy of the space. They didn't overlight it, didn't stage anything fake. They let Max speak in his own rhythm. Calm, measured, powerful. He began by talking about his accident. Not to gain sympathy, but to give context to his journey. How he had rebuilt his life brick by brick. How every small victory had mattered more than the world would ever know. He told viewers what it meant to finally have autonomy again, only to have it snatched away by someone who thought rules were more important than people. He didn't name-call. He didn't gloat. He just said, "I was never the threat to the neighborhood. Fear was." And it was hard not to tear up when he added, "You don't have to walk to stand for yourself." After the segment aired, the ripple effects spread further than either of us expected. Disability rights groups began using the footage as part of awareness campaigns. Schools asked for permission to show it in civics and ethics classes. Even real estate forums were sharing the story as a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA power. And then came the real shift: calls from state policymakers who wanted to meet with Max again. This time, not just to hear his story, but to ask for his input in rewriting the legislation itself. A few weeks later, we found ourselves in a conference room in the state capitol. Max rolled into that room with confidence and was welcomed like an expert. Which he was. He didn't just represent the disabled. He represented the silenced, the marginalized, the people who'd been boxed out of systems built to prioritize uniformity over humanity. The room was quiet as he spoke, lawmakers scribbling notes, nodding slowly. He suggested practical reforms, mandatory ADA compliance checks before any HOA modifications, a statewide audit system for HOAs receiving municipal permits, and a hotline for reporting abuse without fear of retaliation. They listened. They really listened. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout from Karen's regime continued to echo. The audit uncovered years of shady financial practices, and by the time the dust settled, several residents had received refunds for illegally assessed fines. Karen's house finally sold, though the new owners were very clear about their one condition: they wanted no part in the HOA's leadership. The mural on the garage down the street was expanded. Now it showed not just a wheelchair breaking bars, but a whole crowd behind it, walking, rolling, pushing strollers, carrying signs. Above it, in bright paint, "Community means all of us." Max's advisory role with the HOA turned out to be more than symbolic. He pushed for open transparency, quarterly town halls, and a vote to permanently sever ties with Riverbend Modifications, LLC. They passed it all. And in the biggest shift yet, the HOA bylaws were amended to require that at least one member of the board represent accessibility or disability advocacy. Max refused to be the permanent rep. He believed in shared power, but he mentored the first two candidates who applied for the role, both of whom had family members with mobility challenges. The board, once a puppet show for Karen's control, now looked like a team that actually reflected the people it served. And me? My life changed too. Before all this, I was a national anchor with a steady routine, 3 interviews, 2 headlines, and a hopeful closer. I'd covered everything from Senate hearings to celebrity meltdowns. But nothing had ever hit home the way this story did. It had cracked something open inside me. A sense that reporting could be more than observing. It could be personal, real, transformational. I kept covering stories, of course, but I began seeking out others like Max stories buried under HOA fine print, or red tape, or fear. I found them everywhere. Wheelchair users fined for widening their doors, veterans evicted over flag displays, elderly tenants forced to remove mobility ramp. I told their stories, just like I had told Max's, and each one felt like another gate falling. The closing of our final broadcast was simple. No music. Just Max and I sitting on his porch again, the sun low behind us, and the camera slowly zooming out as he spoke the last line. You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to be willing to speak. Then fade to black. But before the credits rolled, the camera captured one final detail. Nailed to the post near Max's porch, just beneath the mailbox, was a hand-carved wooden sign. It read, "Access for all, by order of the community." Someone had left it anonymously, and Max decided to keep it there permanently. It was rough around the edges, a little crooked, but more powerful than any plaque. Because it wasn't official. It was genuine. And in that simple, silent symbol, the whole story lived on. A story of injustice, defiance, courage, and change. A story that started with a gate and ended with a movement. A story that proved the smallest voices, when amplified, can shake even the most stubborn walls. And as long as there are people like Karen building barriers, there will be people like Max. Rolling right through them, one will turn at a time.